Rain was still dripping from my hair when I saw her sitting alone on the curb outside my building, knees pulled tight to her chest, eyes darting like she was tracking shadows. She looked like trouble. The kind of trouble you cross the street to avoid. But something in me didn't cross. Something in me stopped. Her clothes were soaked through, her lips pale, and yet, there was a fire in her eyes. The kind you don't forget. I should have walked past. I should have pretended I didn't see her. But I didn't. I opened my door and asked if she wanted to come in. That night changed everything. The rain had been falling all evening, turning the streets into black rivers that reflected the dim glow of the street lamps. I was tired, cold, and just wanted to get upstairs, kick off my shoes, and forget the world. My shift at the diner had been long, the kind of night where every customer seems to move in slow motion, dragging the minutes out until they feel like hours. My feet ached, my uniform smelled faintly of coffee and fried onions, and the only thing on my mind was the warm, silent emptiness of my apartment. But halfway up the block, I saw her. She was sitting on the curb, hunched forward, her arms wrapped around her knees. Water dripped steadily from the ends of her dark hair, tracing silver lines down her face. Her clothes clung to her like a second skin, heavy and soaked through. She wasn't shivering, at least not in the obvious way, but there was a tension in her body, a rigid stillness, like she was bracing for something. Even from a few steps away, I could see her eyes moving, scanning, flicking from shadow to shadow as though she expected something, or someone, to emerge. Everything about her told me she was the kind of stranger you avoided. But instead of walking faster, I slowed. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was the loneliness that had been gnawing at me for months. Or maybe it was the way the streetlight caught in her gaze for just a second, making something in my chest shift unexpectedly. When I stopped a few feet away, she looked up at me. No smile. No request for help. Just a steady, unblinking stare that made me feel like she was weighing me, deciding if I was worth speaking to. My voice came out quieter than I expected when I asked, "Are you okay?" She didn't answer right away. Her lips parted, but nothing came out. Then, with a small shake of her head, she glanced away, as if the question itself was too complicated. The rain made little rivers down the sides of her cheeks, and I wondered how long she'd been out here. "Do you need somewhere to warm up?" I heard myself asking, even as my brain screamed that I didn't know this woman, that she could be dangerous, that people didn't just sit in the middle of a rainstorm without a reason. She hesitated, studying me again. I felt my heartbeat in my throat. Then she gave the smallest nod. Something about the way she moved, slow, deliberate, told me she wasn't used to accepting kindness from strangers. I stepped back and gestured toward the building. "I live upstairs." My voice trembled slightly, though I hoped she couldn't hear it over the rain. She rose to her feet with an elegance that didn't fit the situation. Her boots squelched against the wet pavement, and as she stepped closer, I noticed the faint outline of a scar along her jaw, pale against her skin. Her presence was heavy, in a way I couldn't explain. Like she carried a history that clung to her as tightly as the soaked clothes. Inside the building, the warm air smelled faintly of old carpet and dust. She followed me up the narrow staircase without a word, her footsteps steady but cautious, as if each step was a choice. When I unlocked my apartment and let her in, she stood just inside the doorway, glancing around like she was memorizing the space. I kicked off my shoes and hung up my jacket, trying to act casual even though my pulse hadn't settled. "You can sit," I said, nodding toward the couch. She walked over slowly, sitting on the very edge, her hands resting in her lap. I found an old blanket in the hall closet and handed it to her. She took it with a quiet thanks, her voice low and slightly rough, like it hadn't been used much lately. I busied myself in the kitchen, making tea, because I didn't know what else to do. She didn't speak, and I didn't press her. When I returned with 2 steaming mugs, she accepted hers with both hands and breathed in the steam like it was the first warm thing she'd had in days. We sat in silence for a long while. I kept stealing glances at her, noticing the way her eyes flicked toward the windows, as if checking for something outside. Every now and then, her fingers tightened around the mug, and her jaw tensed. I wanted to ask why she was out there, why she looked so wary, but something told me I wouldn't get a straight answer. And yet, despite the uncertainty, I felt an odd sense of safety sitting across from her. It was ridiculous, she was a stranger, and there was a sharpness about her that hinted at trouble, but I couldn't shake the quiet pull between us. I didn't know her name. I didn't know what kind of story had led her to my curb in the rain. But as the storm tapped against the windows and the blanket slipped from her shoulders, revealing the curve of that scar, I knew one thing: letting her in was going to change something. And I wasn't sure if I wanted to stop it. She didn't say much the next morning. I woke to the smell of damp fabric and the soft sound of movement in the living room. When I walked in, she was sitting cross-legged on the couch, still wrapped in the blanket I had given her, staring at the steam rising from the mug I'd left on the coffee table before bed. Her hair was still damp in places, strands curling in different directions, and her clothes, though dry, looked wrinkled and worn. She glanced up when she heard me, and for the first time, I saw a small shift in her expression, something between acknowledgement and uncertainty, like she wasn't sure if she was welcome in the daylight. I asked if she'd slept at all. She shrugged, taking a sip of the tea. Her voice was quiet when she said, "A little." It had a low, husky edge to it, and the sound lingered in my mind longer than it should have. I poured myself some coffee and leaned against the counter, trying not to stare, but my eyes kept drifting back to her. There was something magnetic about the way she moved, or maybe the way she didn't. Every gesture seemed deliberate, controlled, like she was careful not to reveal too much of herself in any moment. After a pause, she said her name was Ray. No last name, no explanation. Just Ray. The name felt sharp and soft all at once, like it suited her in a way that made my chest feel tight. I told her mine, and she repeated it slowly, as though testing the sound on her tongue. There was a faint trace of a smile at the corner of her mouth, but it vanished quickly, replaced by that guarded stillness again. I asked where she was from, but she avoided the question, her eyes drifting toward the window. "Not from here," was all she said, and the way her voice dropped made it clear she didn't want to elaborate. The air between us felt fragile, like a thread that could snap with the wrong word. So I didn't push. Instead, I offered her some breakfast. She hesitated before nodding, and I took the time to make something simple: scrambled eggs, toast, and fruit, more to fill the silence than anything else. When I set the plate in front of her, she gave me another small thanks that somehow felt heavier than it should have, like gratitude wasn't something she gave away easily. As she ate, I noticed the small details: tiny white marks along her knuckles, a faint bruise near her wrist, and a thin line of faded scar tissue on the inside of her forearm. They told stories I wasn't ready to ask about. After breakfast, I tried to make light conversation, talking about the diner, the rain, anything that might make the space feel less tense. She answered in short sentences, sometimes just a word or two, but she listened closely, her eyes fixed on me like she was taking in every detail. Every now and then, she'd glance toward the front door, her jaw tightening, and I'd feel that undercurrent of unease ripple through the room. I offered her the couch for another night before I even thought it through. She studied me for a long moment, as though deciding whether to accept. "I don't want to cause trouble for you," she said finally, her tone low but firm. Something about the way she said it made me wonder just how much trouble she was capable of causing. Still, I told her it was fine. She gave a slight nod, but I noticed her hands were trembling when she picked up her tea again. That night, I heard her before I saw her. I had been drifting off to sleep when a muffled sound pulled me back. At first, I thought it was the wind, but then I recognized the uneven breaths, the quiet, choked noises that came from someone fighting off a nightmare. I got up and found her curled tightly on the couch, her hands gripping the blanket as though it were the only thing holding her together. Her eyes were shut, but her face was drawn, her lips moving silently around words I couldn't hear. I stood there for a moment, torn between waking her and leaving her be. In the end, I reached out and touched her shoulder gently. She startled awake instantly, her eyes wide, her body tense as though ready to run or fight. But when she saw me, some of that tension melted, replaced by a flicker of something I couldn't name. She didn't apologize, didn't explain, just sat there breathing hard, staring at the floor. I wanted to ask what she had dreamed about, what had shaken her so deeply, but the question caught in my throat. Instead, I got her a glass of water and sat with her in silence until her breathing slowed. She didn't thank me this time, but when I stood to go back to bed, she looked at me in a way that felt like its own kind of gratitude, quiet, unspoken, but real. I told myself I was just being kind, that it didn't mean anything. But when I lay in bed afterward, the sound of her breathing in the next room seemed louder than the rain, and I couldn't stop thinking about the weight she carried, and why I suddenly wanted to help her bear it. The diner was slow that afternoon, the kind of lull that made every sound feel louder than it should be, the scrape of forks on plates, the hiss of the coffee pot, the faint hum of the refrigerator behind the counter. I was wiping down tables when the television above the register caught my attention. Normally, I ignored the news, but something about the grainy image on the screen pulled my gaze. My hand stilled around the rag, my chest tightening as the words from the anchor's mouth sank in. There she was, Ray, her photograph plastered across the broadcast. The caption underneath read, "State's Most Wanted, Armed Robbery and Assault Suspect at Large." The image wasn't the same as the woman sitting on my couch the night before. This one was colder, harder, her expression caught mid-glare, eyes burning with something sharp. The anchor's voice kept talking, explaining how she was dangerous, how anyone who saw her should avoid contact and call the police immediately. My throat went dry. I must have stared too long because one of the regulars, a man who never stopped talking about the local crime rate, glanced at the screen and said, "Looks like trouble's headed somewhere near us. Hope they catch her before she hurts anyone else." My hand clenched around the rag until my knuckles whitened. I muttered something about needing to check the back and slipped away, my mind buzzing so loudly it drowned out everything else. On the short walk home, my thoughts tangled in a mess of fear and disbelief. Every step closer to the apartment, the same question looped in my head: what if they were right? What if she was dangerous? And what did that mean for me, for the fact that I had let her in without asking anything real about who she was? By the time I reached my building, my pulse was hammering so hard I could hear it in my ears. I unlocked the door slowly, almost hoping she'd be gone so I wouldn't have to decide what to do. But she wasn't gone. She was in the kitchen, barefoot, sleeves rolled up, standing over my stove like she'd been living there for years. A pot simmered on the burner, filling the air with the scent of garlic and onions. She turned at the sound of the door, her face softening when she saw me. "You're early," she said, like this was the most normal thing in the world. I just stood there, my mind trying to match the image of the woman on the news with the one in front of me now. She didn't look dangerous. She didn't look like the kind of person who could do the things they said she'd done. And maybe that was the most dangerous part of all. "Why was your face on the news?" I asked before I could stop myself. The words came out sharper than I intended, edged with something between fear and accusation. Her hand stilled on the spoon she'd been holding. For a moment, she didn't move, didn't even breathe, her eyes locking onto mine. Then she set the spoon down slowly, wiped her hands on a dish towel, and leaned against the counter. "I guess you were going to find out eventually," she said, her voice low, steady. She didn't deny it. Didn't try to laugh it off. She just stood there, letting the truth settle heavy in the room. "It's not what they're saying," she added after a pause, her gaze never leaving mine. "It never is." I wanted to demand proof, to ask why I should believe her, but there was something in her tone, something raw, almost weary, that made the words stick in my throat. "I should probably leave," she said, glancing toward the door. The thought of her walking out into the night made my stomach twist, though I didn't want to admit why. "I didn't say that," I replied, too quickly. Her eyes searched my face, maybe looking for judgment, maybe for some sign of what I was thinking. I wasn't even sure myself. My instincts were split in two, one screaming that I should call the police, the other telling me to listen. The second voice won, though I didn't understand why. "One more night," I said, my voice quieter now. "Then, we'll see." Her shoulders dropped a fraction, as though she'd been holding them tense for too long. She nodded once, no smile, no attempt at charm, just that same guarded acceptance I'd seen before. We ate dinner in near silence, the only sound the clink of silverware against plates. I kept waiting for her to offer an explanation, to tell me something that would make all of this make sense. But she didn't. And when I lay in bed later, staring at the ceiling, I realized that somehow, despite everything I'd just learned, part of me still didn't want her to leave. It rained again that night, a slow, steady drizzle that coated the windows in a sheen of water and filled the apartment with the sound of quiet tapping. Ray sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea cradled in her hands, her elbows resting on the scratched wood, her gaze fixed somewhere far away. I had been pacing the living room for the past 10 minutes, torn between the urge to demand answers and the pull to just let her speak when she was ready. Finally, I sat down across from her and asked the question that had been gnawing at me since yesterday. If it's not what they're saying, then what is it? Her eyes lifted to mine, slow and deliberate, and for a long moment she didn't speak. I thought she was going to dodge the question again, but then she exhaled and leaned back in her chair, running a hand through her hair. "I was in the wrong place, with the wrong people," she said, her voice rough but steady. "And I trusted someone I shouldn't have." She told me about the man who had been in charge, a local businessman who wasn't as clean as his reputation suggested. He had connections, money, and a way of making people disappear when they became a problem. She had worked for him briefly, doing odd jobs that seemed harmless at the time. But one night, something went wrong, a robbery at a warehouse he owned, a guard injured badly, and evidence pointing straight at her. She said the man had made sure it all stuck, because she had found out something she wasn't supposed to know. Her hands shook slightly when she mentioned her younger sister, who had been living with friends since Ray had gone on the run. "I can't let him find her," she said quietly, her gaze fixed on the surface of the table. There was a weight in her voice that made me believe she wasn't lying, even if some part of the story was missing. I didn't know what to say, so I just nodded, letting the silence stretch between us. Later that night, I heard her moving restlessly in the living room, the creak of the couch springs giving her away. When I stepped out of my bedroom, she was sitting on the edge of the couch, her elbows on her knees, staring at the floor. "Couldn't sleep?" I asked. She shook her head without looking up. I hesitated for a moment before telling her she could lie down in my room if she wanted. Her eyes flicked to mine, searching for the catch in the offer. I shrugged, pretending it was no big deal, even though my pulse was racing. She followed me in, moving quietly, almost cautiously, as if afraid to disturb something fragile in the air. I slid over to one side of the bed, and she lay down on the other, staying rigidly close to the edge at first. The rain outside softened to a faint patter, and the room settled into a stillness that felt both tense and strangely comforting. At some point, she shifted closer, not much, just enough for me to feel the heat of her body. I could sense her hesitating, as though debating whether to pull away, but she didn't. When her breathing began to slow, I realized she had fallen asleep. I stayed awake longer, listening to the rhythm of her breaths, feeling the strange mix of safety and danger she brought into my space. In the early hours, she murmured something in her sleep, her voice breaking like she was on the verge of tears. Without thinking, I reached for her hand. Her fingers tightened around mine instinctively, holding on like it was the only thing tethering her to the present. Neither of us let go until the first light began to seep in through the blinds, and when she finally opened her eyes, there was a softness there that hadn't been before. She didn't mention it, and neither did I, but something between us had shifted, quiet and undeniable. The days that followed felt like walking a tightrope. I went to work every evening with a knot in my stomach, always glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see her face on every screen or a pair of uniformed officers waiting at the door. The tension in the air outside seemed to seep into the apartment, but Ray tried to make herself useful, moving through the space as if she belonged there. She fixed the leaky faucet in the kitchen without me asking, folded laundry I had left piled on the chair, and cooked meals that made the place smell warmer than it had in years. She moved quietly, but her presence was constant, something I started noticing more than the ticking of the clock or the hum of the fridge. Still, the shadow of danger was never far. It started with the sound of an engine idling late one night. When I looked through the blinds, a police car was parked across the street, its lights off but its presence heavy. My chest tightened instantly. Ray was in the kitchen, washing dishes, her back to the window. I didn't tell her at first. I just stood there, watching, my breath shallow. But when I glanced back again 15 minutes later, the car was still there, and I couldn't hold it in. "Don't look," I said quietly, my voice low enough to be drowned by the clinking of plates. She froze, her hand still in the soapy water. "Police?" she asked without turning around. I swallowed hard and nodded, forgetting she couldn't see me. She dried her hands, came over, and pulled the blinds down with a calmness that almost irritated me. "They're not here for me," she said softly, but there was something in her tone that told me she didn't fully believe it. After that night, the car came back more often. Not every day, but enough to make the back of my neck prickle every time I left the building. I noticed Ray started sitting farther from the windows, her shoulders tensing when there was a knock at any of the neighboring doors. The strangest part was how the fear and the pull toward her kept growing at the same pace. The more I should have wanted her gone, the more I wanted her to stay. She had a way of looking at me that felt like she saw past everything I kept hidden, and that was terrifying in a completely different way. One evening, I came home to find her in the kitchen again, sleeves rolled up, hair tied back, a cutting board in front of her. She looked up and smiled, not the guarded, polite kind I'd seen before, but a real one, brief and unsteady, as if she didn't know she'd done it. "You look tired," she said, her voice soft enough to take the sting out of the words. I shrugged, dropping my bag by the door. We ate together, and for a moment, I almost forgot who she was, what she'd done, or what they said she'd done. But the world had a way of reminding me. It happened 2 nights later when there was a knock at my neighbor's apartment. We were sitting on the couch, halfway through a quiet conversation about nothing in particular, when Ray stiffened. Her eyes went wide, her head tilting toward the sound. Another knock, louder this time, and then the deep, muffled voice of someone asking for the tenant by name. I didn't recognize the voice, but Ray moved fast, grabbing my wrist and pulling me toward the bedroom. "Don't make a sound," she whispered. I could feel her breath against my ear, warm and quick. We slipped inside and closed the door. She pressed her back to it, one hand gently covering my mouth before I could speak. The gesture was instinctive, protective, but it sent a jolt through me all the same. We stood there in the dim light, our breathing the only sound. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure she could feel it through the inches between us. Outside, voices continued, footsteps moving in the hall, and then silence. After what felt like forever, Ray eased her hand away, her touch lingering for just a fraction of a second too long. Her eyes met mine, dark and intense, and I felt something pass between us that had nothing to do with the danger outside. It was unspoken, but it was there, thick in the air, impossible to ignore. We stayed there like that, neither of us moving, until the sound of the police car pulling away broke the moment. She stepped back first, looking away like she needed to put the space back between us. But the echo of her hand on my skin stayed, and I knew it would for a long time. The storm rolled in without warning that night, the kind that rattled the windows and made the walls hum with low thunder. The power flickered once, twice, and then cut out completely, plunging the apartment into darkness so thick I could feel it pressing against my skin. I was sitting on the couch when I heard Ray's footsteps in the hall, steady but unhurried, as if she wasn't fazed by the sudden blackness. She appeared in the faint light spilling from the street lamps outside, her face cast in soft shadow. "You okay?" she asked, her voice low but clear over the sound of rain pounding against the glass. I nodded, even though my pulse had picked up for reasons I didn't want to admit. She crossed the room and sat beside me, the couch dipping slightly under her weight. We didn't speak for a moment, letting the storm fill the silence between us. In the dim glow, I could see her eyes on me, steady and unblinking, like she was studying every detail. The air felt heavier than it had in days, thick with something unspoken. When the thunder cracked, closer this time, I jumped slightly, and she leaned in without thinking, her shoulder brushing mine. It was such a small touch, but it sent a shiver through me. I tried to focus on the rain, the rhythm of it against the glass, but my attention kept drifting to the warmth of her so close beside me. Her hand rested on the couch cushion, only inches from mine, and I became acutely aware of every tiny movement she made, every shift in her breathing. At some point, I turned to say something, though I couldn't even remember what, but she was already looking at me. We stayed like that for what felt like forever, the space between us shrinking in slow, inevitable increments. When her lips finally touched mine, it was hesitant at first, almost testing, but then it deepened, like we had both been holding something back for far too long. My heart was racing, my mind spinning, but I didn't pull away. Her hand came up to cup my jaw, her touch warm and sure, and I leaned into it like I'd been waiting for it all along. The kiss grew more urgent, the kind that steals your breath and makes you forget where you are. The storm outside seemed to fade into the background, replaced by the sound of our breathing and the press of her body against mine. When we finally pulled back, it wasn't because we wanted to, it was because we needed air. We stayed close, our foreheads touching, both of us breathing hard, neither of us daring to break whatever spell had just been cast. She searched my face like she was memorizing it, her thumb brushing lightly across my cheek. "I shouldn't be doing this," she whispered, her voice low, almost pained. I wanted to ask why, but the answer was already there between us. Her life wasn't safe, and getting close to me only made it more dangerous. Still, I didn't care in that moment. I told her so, and she closed her eyes briefly, as if trying to absorb the words. Later, lying in the dark, we didn't touch, but the space between us felt charged, alive. I could feel her there beside me, every breath, every small movement, and the thought of her leaving, of this ending, twisted something deep inside me. She didn't say it, but I knew from the way her body seemed both at rest and ready to move that she was planning to go soon. The realization ached in a way I wasn't ready to face, but I stayed quiet, because I didn't want to waste whatever time we had left. The storm kept on through the night, and I listened to it, wishing it would never stop, because as long as it didn't, it felt like she might not leave. I woke up to an unfamiliar quiet. The storm was gone, the air was still, and the faint morning light made the room feel almost unreal. My hand reached instinctively for the other side of the bed, but it was cold, the sheets already losing the shape of her body. A strange unease settled in my stomach before I even got up. The apartment felt wrong the moment I stepped into the hallway, too still, too empty. Her blanket was folded neatly on the couch, her mug washed and set upside down on the counter. No note. No sound. No Ray. I stood there for what felt like minutes, staring at the empty space like I could will her to appear if I just waited long enough. But deep down, I knew she was gone. I told myself not to panic, that maybe she just went for a walk, but the truth was heavy in my chest. She'd left because it was safer, because she thought she was protecting me, because she didn't want to drag me down with her. And yet, it didn't feel like protection, it felt like a hole I couldn't fill. I went to work that evening with my mind elsewhere, barely tasting the coffee I drank, barely hearing the chatter of customers. The diner's lights felt too bright, the air too warm. Every time the bell over the door rang, my head snapped up before I could stop myself. I kept expecting to see her, damp hair, guarded eyes, that wary half-smile, but she never walked in. It was just past closing when the noise started. At first, it was distant, a low hum of voices and a faint siren, but it grew quickly, spilling down the street until it was impossible to ignore. I stepped outside and saw the flash of blue and red lights bouncing off the wet pavement. A police car swerved into the block, tires screeching, and the crowd on the corner parted just enough for me to see her. Ray was there, pressed against the side of the vehicle, her wrists locked in handcuffs. Her shirt was stained dark near the shoulder, a smear of blood I couldn't stop staring at. She wasn't fighting them, wasn't shouting, just standing there with her chin lifted, her expression unreadable. My breath caught when her eyes found mine. It was only for a second, maybe less, but the look cut through me. There was no smile, no apology, just a deep, unspoken message I couldn't fully understand. A car door slammed, breaking whatever fragile thread had connected us in that moment, and then she was gone, swallowed up by flashing lights and the sound of the siren pulling away. I walked home in a daze, every step heavy, the world muted around me. The apartment felt colder than ever, like it had been emptied of something essential. I sat on the couch, staring at the folded blanket she'd left behind, my mind replaying the way her eyes had looked in that single stolen glance. That night, lying in bed, I could still feel the ghost of her beside me. It wasn't just memory, it was the way the sheets seemed to hold her shape, the faint trace of her scent clinging to the pillow, the echo of her voice in the silence. I knew I might never see her again, but I also knew I wouldn't forget her. Not the danger, not the fear, and not the way she had made my quiet, predictable life feel alive again, even if it was only for a short while. The days after her arrest blurred together in a way that felt almost unreal. I went to work, I came home, I ate when I remembered, but every movement felt like I was just going through the motions. Her absence wasn't just in the empty space of my apartment, it was inside me, like someone had taken the rhythm out of my heartbeat. The news wouldn't stop talking about her. Every time I turned on the TV or scrolled through my phone, there she was, her mugshot staring back at me. The headlines painted her as dangerous, reckless, unpredictable. They didn't know her. They didn't know the way her hands shook when she lit a cigarette, or the way her voice softened when she asked if I'd eaten, or how her eyes held a whole ocean of things she never said out loud. They didn't know how carefully she listened when I spoke, as if my words were something rare. I avoided watching the full reports, but sometimes I couldn't help myself, letting the words dig into me even though I hated them. She was awaiting trial, the anchor said. She was facing years. I told myself it wasn't my place to get involved, that this was her fight and I was just a small part of her story, but the truth gnawed at me. I couldn't stop wondering if she was eating, if she was sleeping, if she was scared. One night, after another shift where I barely remembered the orders I'd taken, I found myself sitting at the kitchen table with a pen in my hand and a blank sheet of paper in front of me. I didn't even know where to start. What do you say to someone you aren't supposed to have in your life? I started writing anyway. I told her the coffee at the diner had somehow gotten worse. I told her about the cat that kept sitting on my fire escape, staring at me like it wanted in. I told her the storm that night had left a crack in my bedroom window and I still hadn't fixed it because the sound of the wind through it reminded me of her breathing beside me. I didn't write anything about missing her, not directly, but the spaces between the sentences were filled with it. I didn't know if the letter would ever reach her, but sending it felt like a way to push against the silence that had been swallowing me whole. Weeks passed before anything happened. I had almost convinced myself she wouldn't respond when one morning, a small envelope slid under my door. My name was written in a handwriting I knew instantly, sharp, deliberate strokes, just like her. My hand shook as I tore it open. Inside, a single page. She didn't say much. Just that she was alive, that she'd read my letter more than once, that she thought about me when the nights got too long. She didn't say she missed me, but I could feel it in the way she'd written my name twice, once at the start, once at the end, as if saying it made it real again. I read that letter until the paper started to feel soft from my fingers, and then I tucked it away like something fragile. I didn't know what would happen to her. I didn't know if I'd ever share a bed with her again, or if we'd only exist in these stolen words passed through the cracks in the world. But I knew one thing for certain, I didn't regret opening my door that night, no matter how dangerous she'd been, no matter the mess it brought into my life. Because for the first time in years, I had felt something that wasn't safe, wasn't easy, but was alive. And some part of me knew that even if I never saw her again, she'd left something behind that no one, not the state, not the headlines, not even time, could take away from me. If this story pulled you in and made you feel every heartbeat, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more raw, emotional, and powerful lesbian love stories. Leave your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to know how this journey touched you. Your support keeps these voices alive.